Let's pay careful attention to what's happening here. You'll see in the last paragraph on page 10, set theory is introduced. And then it gets a little wonky. He's messing around about X not being a member of itself. That's important. But the last two lines is where the fun starts for us. What is proper to the totality of signifiers? I will show it to you in detail. Involves the following as necessary. If we simply admit that the signifier cannot signify itself, involves the following as necessary. That there is something that does not belong to this set. It is not possible to reduce language simply because of the fact that language cannot constitute a closed set. In other words, there is no universe of discourse. Now, we've talked about the etymology of universe. To make one, to turn stuff into one, to unite is a good way to understand what's happening here with the universe. But don't forget that the UN at the front of universe doesn't just mean one in French, derived from the Latin unus, one, but also has this other meaning in German and English, for instance, where un is a negation. It means not, in addition to one. This play will become incredibly important in Lacan's stuff, and may even allow us to dip back into Seminar 11, which is all I want to do now. But there is some good stuff in Seminar 11 on this that you've heard from me before, but might be worth returning to just to spell it out. First and foremost, let's get some things ironed out about the big other, the symbolic. In the bottom right-hand corner of the graph of desire, you see this A with a circle around it. This is the locus of the other, of the big other, and it is not barred. It is considered full. It is a treasure trove of all the words in a given language. It is a treasure trove of all the signifiers in the signifying chain. The point that Lacan is driving at here is that this container of all signifiers, words, things, etc., is in fact incomplete. There's always something missing from this totalizing set known as the symbolic, the big other language. There's always something that does not belong to it. And what I want to do is tell you exactly what that is in Seminar 14. There's a lot to it, but here's fundamentally what he's talking about here. What is not included in the set known as the symbolic, known as the big other, is the big other, is the symbolic. The container is not included among its contents. And any time in the next hour, when you feel like things are getting a little weird, just remember this. Lacan is fundamentally working with the structural logic of containers and things contained. And the fact that containers are not among their contents. This is why he says there's no other of the other, because at some level, what the big other lacks is a big other that could encompass it the way that it encompasses everything else in the world. There is no other of the other. And that is what the big other lacks, is a relationship to the big other like it imposes on everything that it circumscribes. That's what it lacks, is a big other of its own, a container in which itself can become a contained entity. It's the same with meta-language. There is no meta-language because in order to talk about language, you have to use language. You can't have a language that is above language, because it's a language, so it's still in the field of language. There's no meta language. There's no language about language. Every language about language is just an extension of language. This is what he's getting at here. Not surprisingly, he then shifts to Russell's paradox, the one we were just talking about. For those of you who may have had some difficulty in understanding what I have just formulated, I will recall simply the following, which I already said at the appropriate time, that the truths that I have just stated are simply those which appeared in a confused fashion at the naive period of the establishment of set theory in the form of what is wrongly called Russell's paradox, because it's not a paradox, it's an image, the catalog of all catalogs which do not contain themselves. There it is again. We just heard it in seminar 11. Here it is popping up right at the start, 11 pages into seminar 14. What does that mean? Either it contains itself or it contradicts its definition, or it does not contain itself, and in that case fails in its mission. So think about this really quickly. Russell's paradox is to imagine a catalog of all catalogs which do not contain themselves. Then the question becomes, should this catalog of catalogs be included among the catalogs that it contains? If it does not include itself, then it has to be included because it would, in that case, be a catalog that does not contain itself. If, however, it does include itself, then it has to be excluded from its own categorization because now it's a catalog that does contain itself. That's what Lacan means here when he says, either it contains itself or it contradicts its definition. Note this either or popping again. Or it does not contain itself, and in that case fails in its mission. If it doesn't contain itself, it's a failure because that is one catalog that is not contained in its totalizing set of all catalogs that don't contain itself. That makes the mission of this catalog of catalogs a failure. If it contains itself, well, let's leave it at that for now. I don't want to get us too much in the weeds on this one. I love it that Lacan says this isn't a paradox at all. It's an image. Brilliant. One has only to declare, and this is the important part, that in making such a catalog, one cannot take things all the way, and for good reasons. What those reasons are remain to be seen. What we're going to try and understand now is why you can't take things all the way, why the symbolic can never go all the way, why the big other can never fully account in a totalizing fashion as it purports to, why the big other is never a complete treasure trove, why it's always lacking at least one thing. But what I earlier gave you the statement of, in the formula that in the universe of discourse, there is nothing that contains everything. This is something which, properly speaking, encourages us to be particularly prudent here as regards the handling of what is called whole and part, and requires us at the origin to distinguish very severely. This will be the object of my next lecture, the one from the totality. Very important theme here. The one, capital O1, from the totality, which precisely I have just refuted because there can't be a totality, saying that at the level of discourse, there is no universe. There is no counting as one. You can make things count as one, but only in a way that places under erasure the necessary incompletion of that count, which we'll discuss with lots of examples, so hang tight. Which undoubtedly leaves still more in suspense whether we can suppose it to be anywhere else, to distinguish this one from the countable one. So the one in question for Lacan is not the countable one. It's not the one that is a universe, a made into one. There's a one that Lacan wants to discuss, an un, that is separate from sets where you've gathered things into one collection, a universe. And that's the problem with the universe, is that there's always one thing, too many, that hasn't been counted. There's always an additional one still to count. And why is this important? Because this one that is not counted in the totalizing set of the symbolic, of the big other, of society, whatever you want to call it, it slips and slides like the ferret we discussed in seminar 11, and can only be the one by repeating itself at least once. I think this is the trickiest part in the readings that we're discussing now, is the idea of repetition and repeating itself only once, and closing in on itself to establish at the origin the lack involved, namely, the one involved in the establishment of the subject. And I would advise you to hear him say, when he says the one involved in the establishment of the subject, as a figure of that capital O1 that is not counted by the symbolic, and also as a figure of the lack that he just referred to there as well. This is effectively Lacan's introduction to seminar 14. So on the one hand, you have something that is countable as one, a collection of things that can be gathered together and grouped into, I don't know, one language, one society, one city block. You can gather all the houses up and say, this is one city block. We can make all of these houses count as one. It's a totalization of all the houses on that block. Lacan's point, though, is that these totalizing efforts are always incomplete for some structural, logical reason. There's always something that is being left out, necessarily so. So fantasies of wholeness, plenitude, completion, and if you've got ears to hear, I am talking about the fundamental fantasy that the subject has relative to the big other, that the child has relative to the parent. The fundamental fantasy, in other words, that these are not desirous big others, but demanding big others. They don't lack, they are full. That's the fundamental fantasy. The fundamental fantasy to be traversed in psychoanalysis is that the big other is whole, complete, full, in a way that you are not. And as a result, can and should issue demands instead of doing what we experience on a daily basis, which is confront us with desire. The symbolic is the register in which things are made to count as one. But then there's this other place, this other register. I hesitate to use register here, but it serves us well enough. Not where things are made to count as one, grouped together like houses on a city block, but something that is a one that is necessarily excluded from that earlier count. Here is a one as un, in the sense of not, in the sense of negation, as cut, as we'll see as unary trait, UNARY trait. There's that UN again. Here what we see is not the symbolic, but the subject, the split subject. And where else are we now but precisely in that either or of being and meaning that we saw in the early 200s of seminar 11. There's the other in the field of meaning that purports to have an answer to all questions. And then there is the field of being, which entails the split subject. In a very real sense, seminar 14 is picking up where Lacan leaves off in seminar 11 on the topic of alienation and separation. And remember, the big theme here is containers and contents. containers are not among their contents. Hold that thought as we move forward here.